Hello everybody, Julian Charles here of themindrenewed.com, coming to you after our forced break due to the flood waters here that thankfully have pretty much dried up by now. We've got our dehumidifier going full time. Coming to you from the depths of the Lancashire countryside here in the UK. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome to the programme Thomas R. Goehle, author of the fascinating, I think really important book, America's Post-Christian Apocalypse, published recently, September 2015, which has the intriguing subtitle, How Secular Modernism Marginalized Christianity and the Peril of Leaving God Behind at the End of the Age. And as I said, I think it is an excellent book. It's not a quick read. It is in fact 562 pages long, so it does take quite a few sittings to get through, but it is absolutely worth the effort, and it's absolutely worth the price, which isn't really that much, given the significant amount of research that clearly went into this and the quality of the writing. So I do highly recommend people to get a copy of this book. Anyway, we'll get into more about the detail of this in just a moment. So let me welcome you, Tom, to The Mind Renewed. Thanks very much for coming on the programme.
Oh, thanks for having me, Julian. I appreciate it. Thank you.
It's great to be speaking with you. I really did enjoy reading this book. As I said to you before the interview got going, as with pretty much anything you ever read, I didn't agree with 100%, but you'll be pleased to know I sort of agreed with about 99%, so that's pretty good going.
That's great.
I said in the email to you that your writing very much reminded me of the writings of Francis Schaeffer, the theologian and cultural analyst, and I think the nature of the project itself, where you're assessing the culture of our times and seeking to understand that by tracing various philosophical, theological, sociological, historical strands that were sort of all conspired to lead us to where we are today. That was obviously very Schaefferian, but also because of your style. You seem to have this great ability, rather like Schaeffer actually had, to paint with a very broad brush and summarize a huge amount of data in a way that makes it easy for us to take in. So, thank you for writing the book, and thanks for doing it in that kind of way. But could we start, before getting into the detail of it, by finding out a little bit more about you? Could you give us an idea of your background, and why it is you came to write a book as massive and as detailed as this?
Well, basically, I recommitted my life to Christ when I was around 27. And it's all I knew was one thing. After about a year, I got really hungry to learn. So I went off to seminary. I think I was around 30. And I didn't really have any idea that I was going to go into the ministry per se, because I'm just a pretty regular guy. But I was just so hungry to learn. So I went to seminary and took basically philosophy of religion is what I got my master's degree in, and a lot of apologetic courses and things like that. And even then, I remember my dad came out to visit me one time, and he said, "Tom, what are you going to do with this?" I said, "I really don't know." I said, "I just know I've got to learn." But during that time, it would just pop into my head, maybe you should write. And I just kept dismissing it because I thought, well, I'm not a writer. But after about 2 or 3 years, I kind of thought, well, maybe I will write something someday. And after I got my master's degree, I just kept studying, and I studied Enlightenment philosophy and how it interfaced with Christianity. And then a thesis started to form in my head, and the rest of they say is history. That's how I came to write the book.
Mm-hmm. So you say Enlightenment philosophy interest. So this is the European philosophy of sort of 17th, 18th century, that sort of time?
Yes, that's right.
Mm. Yeah. So did you get into that study always considering it from the point of view of Christian apologetics, how Enlightenment thinking impacted Christianity, or was it just an independent interest of yours?
No, most of the books I read had a Christian bent to them, and so they would explain how the Enlightenment interfaced with Christianity. I think the other thing, I remember watching a television program where they would have Christianity was just lambasted on the program. Like this was in the 90s, and I thought, when did this become okay to happen? It just really took me by surprise. And then when I'm reading this Enlightenment stuff, and I'm thinking, my gosh, the stuff that is going on today in our culture, the thinking that's going on today, you can trace this all the way back to the Enlightenment. I guess that's really how the book came to be, because you could just trace this back, that the ideas and the political correctness that we have in our culture today didn't just pop up out of thin air, that you can trace it all the way back to the Enlightenment period.
Yeah, and I mentioned Francis Schaeffer's writings. Did they actually have much of an impact upon you?
Yeah, I read quite a few of his books, but especially I think The God Who Is There, which I love that expression. I would have thought of that myself. I did use it, I think, a couple times in my book. C.S. Lewis, somewhat. Schaeffer, and then just other cultural critics is what I was reading basically. But I liked Schaeffer's writing style because he could put ideas forth simply, but he did it with grace. He didn't have a polemic style, and I kind of liked that. So, yeah, it did definitely have an influence on me.
And I'm getting the impression that this research has been going on a very long time. Am I right in thinking that it's been, well, over 10 years of work have gone into this book?
Yeah, actually, off and on. I mean, I've had to work, but I would say 20 off and on, because I got my master's degree in 94, and I kept studying, and that's when I was starting to study up on the Enlightenment philosophy and things. So say 94 until, the book came out last year. So it wasn't every single year, because some years I barely got anything done on it. But all that time I was studying pretty much the bibliography in the back. I haven't looked through every single book, but I would say probably at least 85 to 90 to 95% of those books I read cover to cover.
Wow.
You know yourself, it takes a long time to read books. You can't just go plowing through everything, and you've got to extract all that information. You've got to organize all the information. Like you said, it's 562 pages. Just so people don't get thrown off, I think it's about maybe 400 of text, but I do have like 45 pages of endnotes. So
yes, that's true.
I got So
that was quite a relief, actually, in a sense.
Exactly.
And I thought, wow, how am I going to get through this? And then I got to about 80% of the way through, and I thought, oh, I'm almost at the end now.
Exactly.
But, when you have taken so much learning there over so many years, and, that could be quite off-putting for people to think, well, I don't want to read a book that's going to be so academic. But actually, it doesn't come over that way. I think you've, rather like Schaeffer, you've very successfully condensed a lot of what you have learned there, made it approachable for people. So I don't think people should be put off by it at all. I think a lot of what you say there is actually not just interesting. I think it's actually really important, and I think that will come out as we discuss today, and indeed in our next interview, because we've already agreed that we're going to need a couple of interviews to cover the amount of things that you talk about. So it's going to be quite a long process having a look at this book. But let's start with the main thesis of your work, because so much of it branches out into the various discussions we can have from there. And right at the beginning of chapter 1, you say it like this. You say, the thesis of America's post-Christian apocalypse is that over the past century and a half, secular modernism stroke postmodernism has increasingly replaced Christianity as the hegemonic authority in our society. Now, I'm going to say that again because it's quite a mouthful. So, everybody, ready? Well, here it comes again. The thesis of America's post-Christian apocalypse is that over the past century and a half, secular modernism, stroke postmodernism, has increasingly replaced Christianity as the hegemonic authority in our society. Now, how would you basically explain or summarize that thesis to somebody who didn't perhaps know those terms very well?
Well, secular has to do, people think it's always secular versus sacred. It's not just that. Secular comes from like the Latin saeculum, which has to do with time or age. So a lot of times when I use secular in the book, it has to do with somebody who would be secular would be somebody who's completely time-bound, somebody who's totally a child of this age. They have no vision of eternity anymore. Their only concern is the here and now. And I really think that is the case today. People do not think about God or eternity anymore. They only think about the here and now. Secularization would be the historical process of secularism being carried out in society. And it's the notion that there's a loss of authority of religion and other worldly concerns. And again, it's this idea of only focusing on this world alone. And it's the process by which sectors of society are removed from the influence of religious beliefs or religious institutions. As far as modernism goes, it's closely related to the secular. It literally means, it comes from Latin modernus, meaning just now. So you can see there's a similarity between the secular, which is this present age, and modernity, which is just now.
Would you say that there is also an element of the up-to-dateness about modernism? So you have the secular, which is the here and now, but modernism would be here and now, but we're now the best we've ever been.
Yeah, definitely, because, well, look at John Dewey. He said basically one of the 4 criterion that he would have was that it's the experimental study of nature in order to gain technology for social progress. So, yes, it's this progress plays a big factor in definition of, say, modernism. The two are tied together. definitely it's an unbridled belief in progress. I guess that would be the more fall into the definition of modernism, like you said.
And this brings us back to what you were talking about, this interest you have in the Enlightenment, because people talk about the Enlightenment project, don't they?
Yes.
And that seems to be pretty much like that, the secularization of things and thinking that the modern is always the best and we're always improving. So I can see how that very much connects with your interest in that area of philosophy. Okay, what about postmodernism? That's a term which confuses a lot of people, really. It's a bit of an odd one. It seems like a contradiction in terms, but it isn't, obviously. How would you explain that to people?
Well, postmodernism was basically, it was a rejection of the Enlightenment project. So it's a criticism of Western modernism. Everything that's been written in the last 20 years always talks about postmodernism. And I think that term is overused, and I said that in my book. But I think the one place where it's not is the loss of the notion of truth. We don't have a correspondence theory of truth anymore. We think truth is pragmatic. It's whatever works for me. You've heard the expression, it works for me. Yeah. A lot of what I think the problem with postmodernism is it's really autonomy. And that's a lot of the thesis of my book, is that we become autonomous. There was these philosophers like Foucault and Barthes and Derrida, and basically they tried to undermine reality. They said it's basically you interpret reality, you interpret a text if you read it. It's not about the author's intent anymore. It's about how the reader interprets it. So it's basically an autonomy of, I call it this, it's autonomy of hermeneutics. It's autonomy of interpretation. Now it's not about what the author intended when he writes something to you. It's how you want to interpret it. Well, I mean, it's just ridiculous. If you can interpret anything how you want to, again, it ties right in with truth. You've lost the notion of truth, because how are you going to communicate truth if the person can read it, what you say and what you intend, however they want?
Yes. I totally agree with you. The sort of radical postmodernism turns me off completely. I do, however, think that some people are completely down on postmodernism and think it's just a kind of an evil word, and yet actually there are some aspects of it which can be quite useful. Speaking from a position of faith here, one can use some of the insights of postmodernism to critique modernism, which we've already said the postmodernism is a rejection of much of modernism. We can use that and say, well, the general narrative about progress and technology will save us, etc., we can deconstruct that and say, well, that really doesn't hold water. So, I think to some extent it's both an ally to us and also a foe to us, and it depends upon which author you're looking at and how extreme it's taken. But I think what's really interesting about this is that we have here modernism and postmodernism that you identify as being together somehow, this hegemonic authority that's replaced Christianity. And one of the things which Bill Craig says, William Lane Craig, who we talked about earlier before the interview, he says that in some aspects of our culture, we are still modernists. In fact, in most of it, he thinks. So in science, for example, we still believe in truth. You don't drink that poison that's on the shelf because it's going to kill you. It's not open to interpretation.
I agree.
But in other areas such as morality and religion, well, we tend towards radical postmodernism. Well, it depends what you think. It's just a matter of opinion, etc. There's no real truth, but it's true for me. That's true for you. This is true for me, etc. So we have this strange ambivalence going on in the culture. But you, in this sentence, put both of them together, and you say both together have replaced Christianity as this hegemonic authority. So this is an authority that covers everything. What's going on there? How does it express itself as an authority over the whole society?
Well, Enlightenment, things were still objectively true. So like the philosophers, when they disagreed with Christianity, they did it because they thought it was objectively false. Postmodernism today says Christianity, we don't know if it's true or not, but it's intolerant. As far as how it plays out today, the fruit of Enlightenment I call politically correct pluralism, which is the notion that just because there's a whole bunch of different religious belief systems, that's fine. That's just pluralism. Call it religious pluralism. There's no problem there. But what I call politically correct pluralism is that it takes it a step further. It says because all of these religious belief systems exist, they're somehow all true. That's the politically correct part of it. And it is absolutely not true. Because, for example, secular humanism was declared a religion over here in 1961. Now, secular humanism is basically atheism. And that's a religion. Christianity is considered religion. How can they both be true? One says God exists, one says God does not exist. They can't both be true. Yeah. But in our politically correct pluralism, people in a culture would say, well, all roads lead to God. All religions are true. Well, they can't all logically be true. So that's why I call it politically correct pluralism. You have autonomy and loss of Christian authority, which are the two other fruits. Christianity's lost its authority since the Enlightenment period, especially it's accelerated. It's accelerated since the countercultural revolution. But even since Darwin, that's accelerated. And then you have autonomy, which is everybody wants to be a law unto themselves. So that's that part. As far as the fruit of postmodernism, I think you have relativism and then the loss of truth, and then politically correct tolerance, which is, it's one thing to tolerate different belief systems in your culture, but now we think that, they have to be accepted unconditionally as if they're true. And I think that stems from moral relativism. Anything goes nowadays. And so now it's not just a matter of tolerating them. You have to put your stamp of approval on them. You've got to put your imprimatur on them. And I just don't think that is the way to go, because it goes against truth. It goes against objective morals. So those is what I would say are the fruit of secularization and fruit of postmodernism.
You have a really good paragraph here, which I would like to quote from, where you talk about this idea that truth is relative, and you point out just how irrational it is by showing it refutes itself. Let me just quote from you. Quote, "The phrase truth is relative is meant to apply to everyone. But wait a minute. If truth really is relative, then that statement is not true. It is relative. Look at it another way. If that statement, truth is relative, is really relative, then there is no reason to pay attention to it, because it may not apply to me, because it's relative. How can truth be relative and at the same time apply to me and everyone else? But worse than that, how can truth is relative be true and relative at the same time? It cannot. But if the statement truth is relative is not true, then truth is not relative, and therefore that statement is false. Therefore, there is no reason to pay any attention to it." I love the way you work through that. In fact, that reminds me a bit of Alvin Plantinga, actually.
Yeah.
Where he plays with things like that.
I had a hard time with that. I went over that and over and over, because I didn't want the book to be technical, and so I don't want to give people the impression it is. I only do that a few times, as you know, but it's so important. I mean, it's one of the most important things, that we've got to get this notion of truth right. And this notion that is just bandied about today, that truth is relative, you've got to be able to dismantle things like that, Yeah. And so I tried to do the best I could, just logically, and so it was still understandable.
Yeah, I had to quote it because it jumped out at me so much. And I do agree it's a bit convoluted, but if you read it carefully, it's very clear, and also it's quite amusing. As I couldn't help but chuckle as I was reading.
Oh yeah, I love that. Yeah. Good. I'm glad you appreciated that. Relativism always slits its own throat. And that's the thing. It can't get out the gate, because as soon as you say something's relative, then it's self-contradictory. It's self-stultifying, and it just slits its throat and dies on the ground right there, right in front of you. So that's what I was trying to get at, but I had to, you have to use some logic there.
Yeah, and yet this notion has taken root so much.
Yes.
We're going to look in a little while at some of the reasons why that might have happened, some of the intellectual trends that have taken place that have kind of given credence to this way of looking at the world. You said that one of the fruits of this is this political correctness, where people are so concerned about not upsetting each other that they will not address this refutation that you've just brought up. If one view is a contradiction to another, they daren't say that because it will offend, and yet they have to quite radically hold that contradiction in the back of their minds without addressing it, which is, a curious situation. But we have here now, it seems to me, a kind of escalation of this political correctness going on. I mean, for years it's been talked about as something that's just chucklesome, everything's so PC these days. It's become almost a kind of liberal tyranny. And
it's hegemonic.
We're seeing this particularly now. I mean, just very recently, the Oxford University Student Union has had this vote, a non-binding vote, to remove the statue of Cecil Rhodes from Oriel College. Now, I'm no fan of Cecil Rhodes, but the idea of removing that because it might offend people because, of his sort of racist views, or, as an imperialist and all this, well, so what? I mean, this seems to me, anyway, to, invite some education, that people understand who he was and his faults. but not to remove history. This seems to me to be a really unhealthy way to go. And in fact, Chris Patton, the university chancellor, said that the students, he said, who have this views, he said, this is his quote, should think about being educated elsewhere.
Yeah,
and,
right.
I agree, because you can't rewrite history, and that seems to be the kind of impetus that's going on here. I think it's very unhealthy.
Well, you know what it is, too? I mean, if you don't have shared values, what does shared values have to be based around? It be based around what you think is truth, what you think is important in your society. And it always stems back to morals. So if you have a bunch of autonomous people, which is basically what we have, okay, because again, that's one of the fruit of the secularization process. Everybody wants to be autonomous. It starts breaking down society, because if you can't decide what truth is anymore, and truth is just relative to each individual, you have no more basis for society. So see, that's already happening with the example you just gave, okay? How is society going to survive if there's no common values, everyone's autonomous, everyone's a law unto themselves? You are,
and the only value is don't upset each other. That's about it, really.
Well, then it goes to politically correct tolerance. There you go. See, all these things it's just a rat's nest of things that it has a synergistic effect. They all reinforce each other. Once you have the loss of truth, well, then you have relativism. Once you have relativism, you have moral relativism. Once you have moral relativism, you've got to put your stamp of approval on it. Well, then you have politically correct tolerance. You got to tolerate everything. All these, what I call the fruit of the secularization process, they all reinforce each other.
But then again, it becomes self-refuting, because one thing you cannot tolerate is the person who says, I don't think this radical tolerance is a good idea.
Exactly.
You can't tolerate that idea, so it's actually incoherent.
No, that's right. As Christianity becomes marginalized, everything seems to be tolerated except Christianity. And why? Because Christians actually believe things are true, that they're objectively real, like God really exists. It's not just something I made up. People don't want to hear that. It really, a lot of it goes back to autonomy.
Yes, could you expand a little bit upon that notion of autonomy there? Because you have used that word a number of times.
Well, it's autonomos. I mean, auto, self, nomos, law. You're a law unto yourself. You're not making yourself accountable to God. It's the same with Adam and Eve. They did not want to be accountable. They decided they weren't going to be accountable to God. They became autonomous. And look what's happened today. It's the same thing. Yes. It's played right out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I knew we were going to go there with this subject. We talked a little bit about this before the interview, about the first few chapters of Genesis. And we have slightly different ways of looking at that. But that tree there, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I think is a fantastic image that we have there. That is a turning away from any sense of being accountable to God. And it is taking that radical position and say, I'm going to decide for myself what is good, what is true, and put myself in the position of God, as indeed in the story the serpent says, your eyes will be open and you'll be like God. So in that story there, we have this indication that is one of the things about human beings. We do actually want to become our own gods. And a lot of what we see here reflects that psychology that we have, that spiritual psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to leave God behind. And for me, a lot of it just stems to that fact that people don't want to be accountable to God. They'll do anything they can not to be accountable. People just want to be the God of their own lives. And God doesn't exist just because I want him to exist or because it makes me feel better. Why? Because I need God to get through life. God exists objectively. And if that's true, it goes back to truth. Then it's universal. It applies to everybody. It's not just about me. If it's true that God exists, the God of the Bible I'm talking about here, not any God that you just want to make up. I'm talking about the God of the Bible. Then it's objectively true, it's universal, and it's absolute. Just the same way as science. The laws of science, they apply to everybody. We didn't get science because people just decided they were going to be autonomous and just make up their own laws. Or truth is universal. It applies to everybody. We would not have science if truth was not universal. What we have in society today is pragmatic view of truth, whatever works for me. That's not a true view of truth. The true view of truth is the correspondence theory, that if your beliefs to be true need to correspond with reality. Reality is not dependent on your thoughts about it. Reality is independent of your thoughts about it. To have a true belief, your thoughts have to line up with reality, not just what you want to believe. So, for example, if God exists and I believe he doesn't, well, then my beliefs were wrong, no matter how sincerely I hold them. If God exists and I say, yes, I do believe he exists, then those beliefs are true because they correspond with reality. And that's what people want to just say, well, my beliefs are my beliefs, my truth is my truth. No, that's not how it works. It's not truth then. That's just a matter of opinion. Well, I'm talking about logical truth. Logical truth is universal. It applies to everybody.
And it's amazing, really. If we were to go back several generations, we wouldn't be having that discussion at all.
No.
Because everybody, whether they believed in God or not, would agree that truth is true. And yet, both you and Francis Schaeffer, in this sort of modern stroke postmodern era now, are talking about true truth.
Yes.
Actually having to define what you mean when you use the word truth.
Exactly.
So something has definitely changed. And as I said, in a few moments we're going to trace through just some of the strands of how that has happened. Before we get to there, there's another thing I wanted to bring up, which is you would think perhaps that Christians would be very resistant to this political correctness, this way of thinking of a different kind of truth. Surely Christians believe in true truth, and so they would resist this. And yet you say in the book, and I think this is very important for people to take on board, is that you say that there are actually a lot more Christians, of course you're talking about the US, but I think it's quite true about here as well. Many people who claim to be Christian are actually nominal Christians, many more than we realize. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, a nominal Christian is someone who is a Christian in name only. God is completely absent from their lives. God would only comes out for these people when there's a personal tragedy, something like 9/11 happens. I mean, there was banners around here, on billboards, pancake houses, everything, oh, in God we trust. And then as soon as the crisis, as Bush said, we'll just go back shopping. 2 weeks later, all the billboards are taken down, all the banners come down. 2-3 weeks later, the crisis is over and everybody gets back in their autonomous lives and just lives, again, as if God doesn't exist. I call it practical atheism. You have a philosophical atheist can give you reasons that they believe God doesn't exist. That's a philosophical atheist. A practical atheist, which I think comprises a larger and larger portion of our culture over here and yours, is someone who on the practical everyday level lives as if God doesn't exist. They live just like atheists. Okay, they might not know that, but they live just as if God doesn't exist. They don't give God a lick of thought in any of the important decisions, non-important decisions, their daily lives, unless a tragedy comes along. And then, then they'll pull them off the shelf, pray, and then as soon as the tragedy resolves itself, back on the shelf God goes.
But you extend that to a broader collection of people who call themselves Christian than I would have anticipated. I mean, certainly you talk quite a bit about civic religion, which is very interesting in the US, civic religion here in the UK as well. So there'll be a lot of people here, for example, who, if you ask them, or what religion are you, they would put down on their form that they're filling in, they'd say C of E, Church of England. And yet, they might only occasionally go, perhaps at Easter or Christmas or something like that. But there's this other dimension that you talk about. Many people who are perhaps regularly going to church, and they would say, I'm an evangelical Christian, and they'd be quite vociferous about that. But actually, there's a lot about the way they live their lives that is verging on this practical atheism as well that you've been talking about. I found that quite a disturbing thought, that maybe a lot of people who I thought would, oh yeah, definitely, they're Christians, maybe they're not.
Well, I'll even say this. I mean, I think a lot of these people are Christians. The problem of it is they're starting to accommodate culture. They're starting to believe what the culture believes. And again, it goes back to a notion of truth. For example, like 53% of evangelicals think there's no such thing as absolute truth. I mean, that is amazing. I mean, this is the death knell of Christianity. 53% of evangelicals think there's no such thing as absolute truth. What do you believe then? What can you believe? That probably goes to your notion of that you have to question, do these people actually understand anything about truth, or are they really Christians?
Yes.
I mean,
you have to question that. I agree that it doesn't necessarily mean that. I mean, it could mean that they've somehow managed to compartmentalize their minds in a way that I don't understand. Exactly. But nevertheless, it does raise the question, if they are thinking rationally. It
does raise the question.
Well, heavens, who are they really? Yeah, exactly.
Right. 50% don't believe Satan exists now. 33% believe Jesus sinned while he was on the earth. Only 43% now believe the Bible is accurate in all that it teaches. So we have an erosion of biblical authority. And then 40% of born-again Christians believe Muslims and Christians worship the same God.
So there's no difference.
Yeah, there's no difference. Well, see, again,
it's all the same.
Yes, but see how this all plays together? See, it's that politically correct pluralism. Okay? Yeah. You see, this is part of that's just a statistic, but it backs up my thesis about the fruit of secularization. because it's basically saying, oh, see, all roads lead to God. There's really not that much differences and this and that and the next thing. Barna concluded, over here, we are a nation of biblical illiterates. This is the big thing. Christianity is not being passed down to the generations behind us. That is the huge problem. That is probably the biggest problem.
Yes, you bring up Peter Berger's amazing insight to this notion of the plausibility structure, which I think is so important for people to grasp this notion that this is this sort of interconnected web of ideas in the culture. That web of ideas renders beliefs plausible or implausible. It doesn't matter whether those beliefs are true or false. It's just that web of ideas gives a certain credence or lack of credence to any particular idea that comes along. And we've allowed this modernism stroke postmodernism we've been talking about to become so much part of the culture in general, but also within Christianity as well, that some of the ideas of Christianity are not fitting with that plausibility structure anymore. But that's not to say those ideas are false. It just means they're ill-fitting. It's because we've allowed this accommodation to take place to these false ideas. And then it becomes extremely difficult for us to pass down the teachings of Christ and the apostles to the next generation, because that generation is embedded in this web of contradictory ideas. They think, well, this isn't plausible. And so somehow we've got to break that web of ideas. We've got to deconstruct that web of ideas so that the next generation can actually see, actually Christianity is really an option that I can take seriously, intellectually. And of course, this is one of the things that Bill Craig talks about all the time, isn't it? That we've got to make sure that people can see that Christianity is an intellectual option, not just a faith option in some sort of woolly sense, but no, actually it's a worldview that really does make sense.
Yes.
Do you think there's any hope that we're going to be able to break this plausibility structure problem that's before us?
Well, by doing your podcast, you're doing the best you can. Other people are trying to do the best they can. We can try. Do I really think it's going to happen? No, I don't. Look, once you lose that, like in our society, and I'm sure it's the same in your society too, where Christianity is not the default worldview anymore. There's a quote in there that I have, I think it was Novak, who said that the first generation, you still have some of Christianity left. And then every generation after that, you don't really feel the effects of it until later on, maybe 3 or 4 generations. I think I found it here. It says, it's usually the case that the first generation to reject religion continues to live from the internal capital they have inherited from belief in its inward practices. However, they have now made themselves incapable of passing on their inner beliefs and practices to their children. Thus, their children grow up in an entirely different situation, and even more so do the children of their children. In this way, the loss of belief is not generally felt throughout society for at least 3 or possibly 4 generations. So what I said was, we should expect Christianity would have lost much of its cultural authority now that we are 2 generations, so we moved from the countercultural revolution, and this is what we're seeing. Let me quote you another one from Wells. He says, outside is a world that ignores what is most important to Christians and that is in fact now organizing itself on the basis of that rejection. Within the larger society, secularism seems natural because its context gives it plausibility. So again, there's that plausibility structure. To continue with the quote, though, he says, within that same society, Christians' faith seems odd. The bias of our experience in the modern world tilts heavily against a perception that Christian faith is true and equally heavily toward a perception that secularism is true.
Yeah, and I think it's important to stress again that this has got nothing to do with whether things are true or not. This is just how things are perceived to be. So there doesn't have to be any particular argument that's brought up. So, for example, with my daughter, who we're bringing up, she might be heavily influenced by the spirit of the age, as it were, and find Christianity implausible. But that might not be because she has brought up any questions inside her mind. Well, how can God be this? And how can God do that? And how can I reconcile the state of the world with the existence of God? It's none of those questions need to pass her mind at all. She could just be imbibing the spirit of the age, the way the people think around her. And just because of that, what is true can seem to be implausible.
Yes.
And that's a very worrying thought indeed.
I think what we need to do is just like what we just tried to do here a few minutes ago, is you got to explain what truth is. And then most of the time, things that aren't true, you can show that they're incoherent right off the bat, or that they don't fit the facts of experience. I guess that's it. I would say there's 3 criteria for truth. Are they coherent? Does it contradict itself or other known truths? does it fit the facts of experience, in a comprehensive manner? That's kind of where science would say come up. I mean, you look at the empirical realm around you and you say, all right, does this fit the facts of experience? And the third thing is it existentially viable? Is it something, what you believe, is it something that you can live out consistently without hypocrisy? And maybe we can convey, what actually truth is, we would have a fighting chance. Because really, to me, everything stems back to, if people can get away with saying, well, it doesn't matter whether truth, it's all relative, or in the case of religion, all roads lead to God. If people can get away with believing that, you're never going to convince them of what you believe is true. You've got to get them on a notion of what actually truth is, and truth is what corresponds with reality.
And we're not going to talk about this very much in this particular interview, because we're going to save it for the next one. But I do think we need to mention where we're sort of heading with this, because towards the end of the book, you talk about the New World Order, which we've spent quite a lot of time talking about on this podcast. And one of the things you say is that this distorted notion of truth, this radical political correctness, accommodated by the church, indeed, in many ways, this makes people, both inside and outside of the church, prey to this new world order that is indeed shaping up in front of our eyes. Could you explain how this makes us so vulnerable to what is clearly beginning to happen?
Well, I came across a quote the other night, and it wasn't in my book. It was, but it said, if you don't have a shared value system, you are going to be open to totalitarianism. And I thought, I wish I would have put that in my book. I probably touched on it. If you don't have, and see, this is the thing, like, goes back to autonomy. Everybody's a law unto themselves. Everybody's got their own belief system. You have no more shared value system. And things start to go wrong, like you can see they are. I mean, we are heading for some type of economic collapse here. They're probably going to be able to save it one more time. Maybe they'll have to come out with some type of one world currency or something. But if you head in that direction and things start to collapse, you are making yourself vulnerable to totalitarianism, because you're going to be looking for a savior. And that's really dangerous. So
when you say savior, you mean just some system to save you from your predicament? Obviously, you don't mean salvation in a spiritual sense.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. No, I mean a political savior.
Right.
That's a good point.
So whether it's true or not, it's just something that's going to rescue you out of your situation, and you don't care whether it's true or not, because there is no truth. It's just something that's going to help you.
Exactly. So this fellow was a Russian KGB agent named Bezmenov, and basically he said that the Russians had like a 4-stage, what they would try to accomplish to demoralize society. So they had a demoralization phase where the media shapes public opinion in the entertainment industry, ridicule religion, moral relativism. The country starts to collapse, and rot from the inside out. And then you have a destabilization stage. The country's destabilized. See, then it's ripe for a crisis. So, for example, like 9/11, which I heard you talk about in one of your interviews, you can have a false flag. It doesn't matter whether it's legit or it's a false flag crisis. Once you have that crisis, which is what these global elites are trying for, by the way, because then they can just, again, your savior comes in and they can have some type of the New World Order savior come in and try to implement whatever they want to against the sheeple. That's how they do it. They do it through a crisis. Your traditional social structures collapse. Society can no longer function productively. So again, this could be something that's engineered, like a pandemic, civil war, nuclear strike, or whatever. But people then, they look for a savior. They're going to be in such a tizzy. So government could declare martial law. All these bad things are happening. So people, they'll accept anything at that point, just as long as they can have order. And that's the danger of if we don't get back to a Christian worldview where we know what is true and get God back in our country and in our lives, we are setting ourselves up for this type of situation here with because these globalists do not have our best interests in mind. They consider us unwashed masses. They consider us cattle. They want to eliminate 85 to 90% of the population. So that's just a fact.
I noticed that you brought that statistic up a few times. Is that from the Global Biodiversity Assessment?
The 85 to 90%? I got that from a couple of sources. I remember, I think Jacques Cousteau was even one that said, I'm not sure if he brought up the 85 to 90%,
Okay.
but no, that's just pretty standard.
Yeah, we actually have.
you
We've
know.
looked at that issue. I just wondered which particular reference you had in mind with that. We have looked at that issue with a number of guests, actually, and it does seem pretty clear that there is a tradition amongst certain elites that would be a pretty good idea to get rid of most people and the world would be a better place if we could control a fewer, better, select group of people. So, yeah.
Oh,
But
yeah.
all that was in inverted commas. So let me just make it quite clear for anybody who hasn't listened to the Mind Renewed before.
Yeah. Well, these guys, they're trying for a one world government.
And with all this, there is this notion, isn't there, that somehow government is always benign. We seem to have been indoctrinated for such a long time with the view that our government, not necessarily governments of other places, of course, that's a different matter, but our government is always, well, they're incompetent and, they do things wrong at certain times, but basically they have our good at heart. And it's dangerous stuff. And certainly without this, I think without this Christian view of the apocalypse, of course, goes back to your title, there isn't that warning. Whereas with this Christian view of the end of the age, of course, with the one world system that's there, with the arrival of the Antichrist, we do have that warning there that actually ultimately government is certainly not going to be the answer to all our problems. It's something to be fearful of. So if things are actually moving in that direction, the Christian is in a position there to realize the danger of that, unless we have accommodated to the thought forms around us and think, well, I'm not going to take all that sort of thing seriously because that's just biblical fundamentalism, and then we are in danger there. So actually this leads me to, I don't know whether we have time to do this in this particular interview, but I did want to, as I've said a couple of times, look at some of those philosophical and theological trends that have taken place since the Enlightenment and up to the latter part of the 20th century, so that we can see how certain philosophical ideas have then been accommodated to by theologians. Certain anti-Christian, anti-God ideas have crept into the church and changed the way that people have thought, and therefore made us less able to see the signs of the times. I don't know whether you feel that perhaps we've covered an awful lot so far with this interview. Perhaps we should leave that till next time. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Yeah, that would be great, because there's actually a lot to go into with that. So I'm wondering whether this might shape up to being 3 interviews. I did say to you maybe we might do a couple. Would that be okay to do 3? Do you reckon we could do that?
That's okay. That's fine. No problem.
Wonderful.
Be happy to.
It's absolutely fascinating. You've pushed my button with all the things you're talking about in this book, and I do reiterate that it is an excellent book. I do encourage people to get a copy. Is there any way in which people can get hold of it? I mean, does it have to be through Amazon? Is there any alternative way of doing that?
You could probably, you have Barnes & Noble over there or your local bookstores. You can probably order it, but Amazon probably is the easiest way to get a hold of it. You have an Amazon UK over there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. You can get it other ways, but Amazon's probably the easiest way. You can get either the trade paperback version or the Kindle version. If you get the Kindle, I think it's really relatively cheap. I think it's under £5 over there, isn't it?
Do you know, I'm not actually sure, because you sent me a copy yourself.
Yeah.
I'm quite sure that it is relatively inexpensive, and I really do think that it is, really, folks, it is worth reading this book, because there's so much in here that doesn't just tell you facts, but it sparks ideas, and important ideas that you can wrestle with. And as I said before, not in an overly academic way, but it's clear that there's a lot of academic reading and thought that's gone into the preparation of this. So thanks very much for writing it, and thanks for coming on the show. And I look forward to speaking to you again for part 2.
Thank you for having me on, Julian. I appreciate it. Thank you.